bottom of this slide. I'm presenting work from data I gathered when I was an MPhil student at Cambridge in the Faculty of Education. I'm now a PhD student at the Open University in the UK, and I was visiting University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Epistemic Games group with Goal, who's here, and David Williamson-Schaffer, and this work arose from that visit. And I'm going to give just a very quick kind of introduction to the motivation and areas that I'm interested in, and talk about the kind of theoretical shifts that I'm making, introduce the tool of Epistemic Network Analysis, which is out of the Epistemic Games group, and then describe applying that tool to this data from Cambridge and the kind of pilot work that we conducted there. So, my area of interest is in epistemic cognition, epistemic beliefs, epistemological beliefs, whichever particular phrase you want to use. And those can be taken as a lens for a learner's views on what is to be learned. And typically that includes things like how certain people think that knowledge is, how simple they think it is, the source of knowledge, and how people justify it. And the particular context that I'm interested in is information seeking. So I think that the ways that people look for information in online context, but actually in question and answering, this would also be true, provides a fantastic lens onto learners' epistemic cognition. You'll notice, though, that I've crossed out beliefs here and replaced that with commitments, and that's because in recent years there have been calls for moving away from kind of this tacit belief model and thinking about behavioural traits instead, and the ways that learners actually interact with information. And that's the context in which I'm working. So this is a kind of shift towards performance assessment, and it's motivated both in learning analytics by a desire to engage in performance assessment, things like this, and also by a desire to move away from psychometric assessments for epistemological beliefs. So I'm interested in what people do, what they make with the knowledge that they have, and the kinds of data that we can gather using developing tools perhaps give us some unprecedented access to this. And the kinds of things that I think we'd be able to see, these are just some examples. So the ways that people select sources of information, have standards by which to judge credibility, perhaps the ways that they collate information in meaningful ways. So tools like Delicious, which I think is now defunct, but allows you to tag collections of resources. These sorts of things are interesting. And the idea is that we can build a kind of operationalization of a model of epistemic commitments which builds on the earlier models that involve sourcing, justification, and so on, but is based around the way that people select sources, make links between the concepts that they find, and then mobilize that into either just stating claims or perhaps into reasoned argument, and so on. And they do that with particular tokens of information. So they do it with particular claims, and as I said, I'm interested in search context. So to give an example of that, the research that I'm talking about today, I asked 11-year-olds to do some search tasks around role models. That was what was on the curriculum at the time. And one of the questions was, how many women have won the Nobel Prize? And then there was a follow-up on Marie Curie, who was interesting because she won 2 prizes. So they went and found this token out, which is on the left-hand side. And we could see the sources that they selected. So they selected the BBC, Answers.com, and NobelPrize.org. And we could see that they actually said things about these sources. So they said, you know, that's a good site. The BBC was seen as very authoritative. Answers by some groups was seen as authoritative and others not so much. We could also see that they took that information and they tried to explain why this was important in the particular context. Why was it important to the question? So it tells us about her. It answers the question. slightly different responses there. So seeing those connections and being familiar with the work from the Epistemic Games group around epistemic frames, I wondered whether or not there were ways that we could adapt that theory. So in epistemic frame theory, we look at discourse and we look for particular markers of ways of thinking, frame elements, and we look for the connections between those elements. So the elements are elements of the community of practice, and they're usually described as the skills, knowledge, values, identity, and epistemological rules of any particular community. Now, I didn't want to adapt these elements, but rather to think about how my theory could be fit into that and connections mapped there. So again, to give another example, we might observe some students saying something like, we should try looking on Wikipedia for that, and they won't go away and conduct a search, so in this case, information overload. Love animated GIFs. And we can see that they actually search through the page as well. We can see the information they pick out from any particular source as well. So here, just the phrase too much information. We might also be interested in why they've selected this. So the one here indicates it's a reference, so it's a kind of sourcing indicator. And then how they connect that claim to other claims in the same document, or perhaps in other documents as well. And by looking at how they engage with the information, what information they pull out and how it's mobilized, and how they talk in collaborative settings, we can start to spot occurrences and count those. So occurrences of, sorry, the blue is not very easily readable, but that says claims, so this is just tokens of information. The search context, the search terms that they use, the sourcing claims and trace that they leave behind, ways they make connections, and then they're mobilized. So then I was interested in whether or not those nodes could be mapped in the way that epistemic network analysis works. So moving from this to this. So now I'll talk more about epistemic network analysis. So I'm not going to go through a lengthy description of social network analysis, but the general model applies in this case. So we build up connections between elements. Social network analysis, it's people. In this case, it would be the nodes, so particular claims and so on. And the thickness of the line indicates the strength of the connection. So again, we're trying to move from this to this kind of model. And the advantage of thinking about network analysis here is that we can think about the connections as a kind of co-occurrence, and then we can think about the kinds of networks that novices and experts make, or perhaps different types of communities as well, which is obviously what epistemic frame analysis is interested in. We can also compare different groups of students, which is something that I'll show you shortly. So we're interested in going from log data files, so things like this, and this is from the Epistemic Games group research rather than my own, picking out the frame elements, so different colors indicate different elements here, and coding those, such that any particular utterance, if a particular type of element occurs, then you just code it as a 1. Then we can segment that data. So in this case, just a single utterance is highlighted. But in fact, you could think about segmenting such that you were interested in co-occurrences over a set of utterances. So in the example I'll talk about here, multiple questions were given. So the level of segmentation is at the question level. If connections are made within an individual question, that's what I'm interested in. In epistemic games, it's based on rooms, so it's based on particular tasks that students engage in. And those segments are called stanzas, and we're interested in the co-occurrence within those stanzas. And then a singular value decomposition is run on that data, which is similar to a principal component analysis, And that creates a space for us to explore and visualize the distances between groups of networks. So to give an example on that, explain it a bit further. Here we can see two particular frame elements being mapped in space and the data that relates to those. So we see that the yellow is one particular type of element and that's mapped, and the red indicates another. And we can start to build up maps of connections between those elements. So we see additional elements and those get added. Until at the end we get a final network diagram at the end of a game or a task and so on. We can also see that some nodes seem to be out on their own, perhaps pulling in a particular direction, so in this case here, and we can look at what those nodes represent and start to think about how to label particular spaces. So in this case, again, this is from the Epistemic Games group, this quadrant might be labeled product, and we can do that for the other areas as well. Then, in order for us to be able to compare the different groups more easily, we can map the centre of mass of these networks. So the red circle in the middle with a white dot in the middle is the centre of mass for this network, so for this group. Whereas for this group's being pulled further to the right, making more connections in the sort of design and materials quadrants there, while this group is making more connections towards the top of the graph. And we can see those and compare them to each other just as the centre of mass. So that's a very brief introduction to ENA and the kind of background theory here. The data used for this paper, as I said, was from MPhil research at Cambridge, and I previously analysed it using sociocultural discourse analysis with particular regard to exploratory dialogue, which is similar to accountable talk, which people in America are more familiar with, and epistemic talk as well, but not the same as being described here, and I applied ENA to that data. So I had a pair and two trios of female 11-year-old English secondary school students, and the reason I was interested in using groups is one was very pragmatic. I wanted to be able to probe their dialogue, so I have to have dialogue, so they have to be working in groups. The reason for that, though, is that there's a suggestion that collaborative information seeking in school students might actually lead to better information seeking. Lavender is the best known citation there. And there's an emerging suggestion, partly emerging from me, that exploratory dialogue might be epistemic in nature, so in tasks like this, which I think are epistemic, information-seeking tasks, that kind of dialogue is particularly interesting. So there's an hour of assigned tasks on role models with closed questions, so things like how many women have won the Nobel Prize, and more open-ended questions, so why do some people think that Nelson Mandela is a good role model? I think there were about 9 questions in total, and the last one was a self-selected task. And they were asked to answer the question, obviously, and to justify their choices and state their sources. So they were being explicitly asked to do those things. And this was interesting in its own right? So the groups were very different in their activity. The first group was quite successful, characterized by saying things like, it's got all the important information, it's a good site. They were interested in quality both of information and of sources. Second group actually they answered more questions, although fewer of them were correct, and they were characterized by statements about novelty. They would say things like, I didn't know that, and they emphasized the authority of sources. The third group was awful. They weren't very successful at all, and they really emphasized quantity without any regard to source quality. So they'd say things like, there's loads there, and that was their measure of whether or not this was useful information or not. So I went through this prior data set and recoded all of the questions according to the left-hand side here. You don't need to worry too much about the examples on the right. They're just sort of definitions around what I was looking for. So whether or not they were looking at authority or attempting to corroborate, whether they were trying to kind of match their answers to the questions very precisely but very uncritically, or engaging in more exploratory kinds of dialogue, whether they were understanding that there were connections between documents and between different bits of information, and of course between questions, because whilst the questions were individually set, there were links between the answers, and their search and general task requirements language as well. And this was mapped using ENA, and we can see the description here. So I'm just going to go through the different groups. So the first group, which is in the blue dotted lines here, and remember they were quite successful and were very interested in quality of information. They were making more connections around the kind of task requirements, so the sort of general and specific task requirements, and the simplicity of knowledge. They were understanding that there were connections between the different bits of information they were finding. And they were saying things like, we have to say why it matters, so whatever the fact was is important because. That's the kind of connection that exemplifies. The second group was sort of superficially more successful, but in fact was slightly problematic. And their group emphasised authority more, so making connections to authority, and saying things like the answer's whatever the claim was because it's a good site. These are kind of canned phrases. They're not exactly what was said, but they're kind of exemplifications of the kind of connection we would see in their dialogue. And then the third group, they were actually interesting because they made their dialogue was so simple that they were actually making very few connections at all between the different elements of what I was looking at. And they were using a lot of corroboration, so they would look at information that was repeated across websites, but again with very little regard to the quality of those websites. So answers.com, which is sometimes fine, but I happen to know in this case was not very accurate, was treated exactly the same as the BBC, and if information was repeated across multiple sources, regardless of the quality, it was seen as being important information. And they weren't targeting that information at the question either, so we don't see connections to either of the question facets here, so either the general or the specific elements. So why is this interesting? The first claims are kind of just from the research in general, that epistemic commitments can be seen in collaborative web search, and that they can be seen in the dialogue, the discourse, that students engage in and the ways they engage with sources of information. In terms of ENA, the interesting thing is whether or not it provides a kind of conceptual resource, a representational tool for thinking about this and for depicting it. And this is particularly interesting in terms of comparing multiple groups, including potentially experts and novices. And certainly in this case, manual analysis told me more, but the epistemic network maps were informative. Now, of course, you might say, well, of course they're informative, Simon. You designed your coding scheme precisely to get the result that you wanted to get here and so that you could depict it like this, right? And I take that sort of circularity point. But the point here is not that I'm trying to say, hey, look, this is a new finished theory, or that this is definitely the way forward, or that these are empirically solid results. The point is to demonstrate the ways in which we might use a tool like ENA and the ways in which connections are interesting and the kinds of commitments as opposed to thinking about psychometrics and so on. And this, I think, is potentially useful because we can think about kind of hypothesis generation. So looking at the different types of connections that different groups make, so how they connect authority to corroboration, how they think about authority in terms of mobilizing claims into arguments and so on. And it avoids some of the issues around creating this false dichotomy of either students look for authority or they look for kind of corroboration, but actually often they do both, and actually those connections are often the most interesting kinds of and sophisticated behaviours. So I think there's potential there. Thank you.
They're using SMA analysis on data from Wikipedia to do what they call ideation.
Okay, cool.
And it is so that's one point I think really relevant to what we're doing. And then the other question, so kind of generated from the comparison is kind of, I don't know if it's a logical question, but it kind of comes across as if you have too few data points to do this kind of analysis.
I mean, that's definitely true, and that's why I'm not trying to make any big claims about empirical results here, right? Like, this is a very small study, but that doesn't mean that the kind of representational tool and the theorizing isn't interesting.
It doesn't, but it's actually just very interesting to combine with. So we wanted to do that on our process data. I'm wondering if it really applies. So that's why I'm asking you.
Sure, yeah. Well, hopefully I'll be able to tell you in about a year, because we're planning bigger projects at the moment, and I imagine that I will try and continue some of it. You know, this was done a year and a bit ago now, so obviously my thinking's been updated a bit, but we'll be continuing the line of work, yeah. Thanks. Can I get I'll get the reference off you after.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks.
I think I might have not really understand the DNA actual diagram. My memory is that the length of the line doesn't really matter to anything, but it's the thickness of the line. Can you draw the network diagram?
Can I defer that question to Gol?
Yes. So the link between the nodes means that there was some co-occurrence occurring between those two elements, right? So at some point, whatever time the presentation is, by questions, you said, those two codes were coded within that segment, so there was a co-occurrence. Now, the thinnest line will represent the lowest number of co-occurrences, so 1. And the thicker the line is, the more time those connections are made over time.
So what about the length? My memory was the length of the line is not...
Oh, length. Okay, that's what you're saying. I'm sorry, I heard length. The length of the line, so depending on where the nodes are in the space, helps you interpret the space.
So the space is my question, right? So you use that space a lot. So the placement of those nodes in that space actually is meaningful.
Yes,
Yes.
exactly.
Because you're calculating center of mass and you're separating them into different quadrants. So I need to re-understand how the length matters, because that was not in my...
Yeah, the space is created on all the data that he had, and so the distance between the network, or the distance between the center of masses of the network, since we need one centralized location for each network, actually matters and means something in that space. And you interpret it by looking to see where the nodes in the network are located.
I should say as well that the diagrams I presented are slightly simplified. So for example, thickness they're all exactly the same thickness, right? That's partly because just a function of the small data set, right?
I mean, that slide, if you have coordinate space now, that slide interpreted into more of a mainstream qualitative analysis coding, so it makes more sense to me, at least, coding dimensions.
Sure. So you can, so the slide that shows the centre of masses is the best way of doing that, and you can do t-tests on that. That's right, yes? Yeah.
Yeah, so Simon has a small sample for the study, but let's say you had a large enough n where you could actually take the centers of masses for two different groups and then calculate some sort of significance testing. You could do that using the tool.
So I had a question about your theoretical framework. So you crossed out the weed,
Right.
and you said he was focusing more on officer behavior. But it seems like you can still, you're taking kind of like a static approach to understanding so the epistemic commitments of particularly. So in this process of theorizing, I wonder where you're going next in terms of allowing for changes in that,
Sure.
and not that people get put in the boxes and say, well, this is my belief. Yeah.
So temporality is hugely interesting to me. So the ENA tool actually will allow you to map trajectories. I just haven't shown that. So that's the ways that the connections build up over time. Of course, that's still within this kind of highly localized environment. The other thing is that one could very easily do a similar study a year on and compare the distance between the original network of those participants and then the subsequent network, right, and see how that's changed. So there's an element of temporality there. Of course, you can also do test-retest on a psychometric, so that's arguably not terribly interesting, but it is one method that you could build that in. The other thing is the level of the segmentation matters in terms of temporality. So we're saying that connections made within this set of utterances, so within the stanza, the question in this case, are the ones that's where we look for co-occurrence. And again, there's an element of temporality there because if you went